Okay, thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, Peter and Scott, for having me here. I'm really honored to have this talk for IMCC. And yes, indeed, my talk is co-speech gestures in professional contexts, a multimodal analysis of simultaneous interpretation. And in the present talk, I will present some preliminary results of a research being carried out by an international group of scholars headed by A.Cienki at the Center for Socio-Cognitive Discourse Studies, or SCODIS, at Moscow State Linguistic University. And first, let me, I hope it's going to work, okay. And first, let me give you the outline of the talk. I'll focus I'll start with a brief overview of cognitive studies of gestures in professional contexts. Then I will go over to specific features of simultaneous interpretation. Then I will focus on aim and research questions and hypotheses, design procedures and methods of the empirical research. Then we'll talk about results, and we'll see whether the questions were answered, the hypotheses were confirmed, and what kind of implications does it all have for the future research. And finally, I will give a number of concluding remarks. So, as we know, the importance of gestures as tools for successful interaction has been acknowledged for various professional environments, such as court and business communication, politics, doctor-patient talk, foreign language acquisition, learning, and teaching. Some researchers point to the fact that gestures can become key elements in conveying subtle messages in arts, especially for dancers, actors, or orchestra conductors. On the slide, you can see only just a few names of the researchers who contributed extensively to the topic to show that in professional hands, body movements can persuade and dissuade, kill and heal, distract and attract. To me and my colleagues, one of the most exciting areas of gesture studies nowadays is translating and interpreting. But there are surprisingly few cognitive multimodal research in this area. In the meantime, this type of professional activity is crucial for understanding how we construe the world, finding ourselves between languages, and how we mediate meaning under pressure during extreme linguistic tasks, and what implications it has for bodily cognition. So, taking a cognitive stance, we switch over from the idea of interpreting as reproducing to interpreting as construal. And I'd like you to have a look at these two well-known definitions of translation and interpretation. The first was offered by Nida, and it says that translation or interpretation consists of reproducing in the receptor language the closest natural equivalence of the source language message, first in terms of meaning and secondly in terms of style. Cognitive linguists actually elaborated on the idea, but actually turned it into something else, which really differs from this traditional understanding. Translation and interpreting is a constructive process, so that the mediator or recipient construes a mental model of what is being communicated. And so translating and interpreting is a very specific construal process. What are the features of simultaneous interpretation that make this kind of activity specific? The most important one is that, as we all know, this is a multilingual or bilingual activity. And in this respect, the area of gesture studies that seems to be the most relevant for translation and interpreting is second language acquisition studies. And here, I'd like to mention earlier works by Marian Goldberg and other researchers who showed that gestures can be used instead of words and play a role as compensatory device. They help bilinguals and bilingual learners with different levels of proficiency to retrieve words from their memory. However, in her later works, Goldberg argues that when we speak in a foreign language, we do not use gestures primarily to replace words or to mimetically solve lexical problems. We also use more abstract gestures to handle discourse-oriented difficulties and to produce metalinguistic comments. So if we look at the findings on gestures in second language acquisition, when we start asking questions about how gestures are used in bilingual contexts of a different kind, that is, in a specific professional setting or in simultaneous interpreting, and whether we will observe compensatory gestures, mimetic gestures, abstract gestures, or maybe very few gestures, or maybe no gestures at all, because quite often interpreters are usually advised against using too many gestures, and probably it might influence their gestural patterns and gestural behaviors. So before anyone starts answering these questions, there are other features of simultaneous interpretation that I would like to highlight. So the first one is multitasking, which means that an interpreter establishes multiple links between the mental representations of an object and its linguistic representations in two languages. The link between abstract concepts are less straightforward. The interpreter carries out multi-vector activities. He identifies, interprets, and produces speech, encodes and decodes verbal signs from different languages. He decides whether to compress or decompress the source text, whether to trade off precision for speed or not. And he also maintains control over the source text, his own speech production, and the situation around him. And this multitasking, along with the time pressure, leads to cognitive overload. Second, what we have in simultaneous interpretation is simultaneity on several levels. First, it is simultaneity of actions. And I will have to read this out because this is really very tricky. Between the speaker's oral production and the interpreter's oral production, the interpreter's listening and the speaker's oral production, the interpreter's listening reformulation to a different language, and interpreter's oral production. Second, if we look at this simultaneous process at the cognitive level, because of the time limit, the interpreter stores and retracts information from short-term to long-term memory, focuses attention on some objects and defocuses others, processes and organizes incoming information, and recognizes the intentions of the speaker. Third, I would also highlight this feature of cross-modal embodiment, which is also a tricky one. Actually, interpretation and translation are embodied in more than one way. On the one hand, like any other speech activity, the interpreters, their actions rely on sensor-motor experience or bodily acts, like gestures. On the other hand, as Stachowiak-Chimchak indicates, embodiment here is cross-modal. A mental image from one channel or modality, verbal, for example, can trigger another from a different modality, tactile, for example. For instance, you hear about a forest, and when you translate it, you touch the table like this. I don't have the table in front of your eyes, as if to show the way the forest actually spreads beneath you, spreads everywhere. And finally, simultaneous interpretation is characterized by a unique workplace. interpreter is there and not there at the same time. He is often heard but not seen. In some ways, the interpreter is an indispensable part of interaction, but he is not a participant in the full sense. So I hope I actually impressed you with these superheroes of simultaneous interpreters. With a view to all these features, we actually set the following aims. The aim was to investigate the use of hand gestures by simultaneous interpreters working in a booth to gain insight into means by which speakers in situations of cognitive overload and time pressure offload conceptual content through the use of hand gestures. So the research questions are as follows. What is the role of gestures used in moments of disfluency during simultaneous interpretation in terms of quantity and functions? Are there significant differences in gestures used with disfluencies depending on the expertise of an interpreter? 3. Are there significant differences in gestures used with disfluencies depending on the direction of simultaneous interpretation? And we propose the following hypothesis. Although interpreters are taught to avoid producing gestures, extensive use of gestures with various functions is likely to be observed during speech disfluencies. The variation in gesture use relates to the expertise of an interpreter. And finally, the variation in gestures in gesture use relates to the direction of simultaneous interpretation. That is, whether this type of interpretation is from L1 or L2 to L1 or the other way around. To check these assumptions, an empirical study was carried out. We invited, and we actually analyzed about 31 interpreters, 11 more experienced, 3+ years of intensive simultaneous interpreting. 20 of them were less experienced, less than 3 years of non-intensive experience. All of them are native speakers of Russian. And actually we analyzed 2 directions, from English to Russian and from Russian to English, and we used audio and video recordings from each. And we made them from 3 cameras, one of them with the over-the-shoulder view, and you can see this in the photos. The second one is on the table in front of the interpreters. It provides us with a close-up view. And the third one was actually in the eye tracker for analyzing gaze movements during interpretation, but I'm not going to talk about this today because Hert Bronny is actually working on this right now. And as our stimulus material, we used 2 TED Talks on biodiversity and the extinction of species. So there were 2 tapes, audio tapes, in 2 languages that were very similar in their contents, and both of them were actually original, the original recordings. As to procedures and methods, before collecting the data, we distributed 2 glossaries with 20 specific terms, like, for example, vascular plants or the Cretaceous period and so on. And the participants were invited to 45-minute sessions. Before they took part in this empirical study, we offered them language experience and proficiency questionnaires to fill it out, and a test on handedness, and there were also informed consent. Then participants were invited to one of the classrooms at the university used for teaching simultaneous interpreting, and specifically to a professional interpreting booth, which was equipped with the video cameras that I just described. The participants were instructed not to bring with them any notes, papers, or any other objects or anything that they might hold in their hands. To sort out and analyze the data, triple ELN files were created with 3 views from 3 cameras. The speech and gestures in each video were transcribed and annotated, 3 teams with 3 coders each, based on consensus between and across the teams. We annotated 2 categories, difficulties or disfluencies and hand gestures. And let me show you these subcategories. But I should say that we're actually revising them and making them more precise. So I would like to say that among these disfluencies, we have restarts of words or phrases. This could involve repetition of words or parts of words. Then we have truncation, when someone suddenly cuts off a word or phrase. This might be part of a restart, but might not necessarily involve a restart or repetition after it. Then we actually paid attention to filler words like well, and so on, which were not part of the original source text, and a momentarily marked slower tempo in speech, and also dragging out of particular words and sounds while speaking. And we also included resolution, that is a stretch of very fast speech right after a longer than usual, or a repair of a word or phrase produced after having cut off a word or phrase. And recently we also started paying attention to such noises that we can't actually decipher, and we call them mumbling. And as to gestures, we paid attention to their functions, and we used one of the most widespread classifications based on the findings of Cornelio Müller, Jana Brassam, and A.Cienki. So we single out adapters, self-adapting gestures and other adapting gestures like gripping one's hands, scratching, rubbing the desk, etc. Then we also analyzed representational or mimetic gestures, depicting the content of the speech via 5 modes that were introduced by Cornelio Müller: acting, molding, holding, tracing, embodying. Also, we singled out one group. We called it pragmatic gestures. They show a stance towards what is being said, such as negating, qualifying, expressing uncertainty, emphasizing, and so on. So we also singled out beats, but actually we thought that we might include them into pragmatic gestures. And also dactic gestures, which were pointing or touching gestures. And we also paid attention to additional subcategories. In addition to beats, we also actually annotated whether gestures were right, left, or both hand, and sometimes, but we're not really very consistent about this. We also look at what kind of unusual head or mouth movements we can notice here. But I believe that this is going to be part of our future analysis. Now, let me give you an example of disfluency accompanied by molding representational gesture. Usually disfluencies are marked with pauses, fillers, and dragging words, and we can see practically all of them here. And I hope you're going to hear this.
Becomes not good for sustaining life.
The analysis of video data provided answers, at least on a preliminary basis, to our research questions. And, and probably we'll have a look at question 1. And let me remind you of this question. It was, what is the role of gestures used in moments of disfluencies during simultaneous interpretation in terms of quantity and functions? So what we have now is that 65% of disfluencies were used with gestures. As to gesture functions, we actually found out that self-adapters and pragmatic gestures, beats are mostly pragmatic gestures as well, so we count them here, prevailed for both groups of participants. And adapters or self-adapters didn't come as a big surprise because, as I noted earlier, simultaneous interpretation involved multitasking and simultaneous activities both at superficial and cognitive levels, which in its turn presupposes cognitive overload and probably anxiety because a lot is usually at stake. And as we know, there are studies mostly in psychology, psychiatry, that shows significant link between emotions and nervousness and the use of adapters. So to actually, the second finding was actually that gestures are multifunctional, which is not really a surprise as well. And one of the most probably frequent patterns were that often representational gestures were also pragmatic gestures. And to give you a feel of these multifunctional gestures, I'd like to show you another episode. And again, this one was a less experienced interpreter, simultaneous interpreter. And look for the gestures co-occurring with this concept. The gesture is representational, as if she's holding this concept. At the same time, her palms reach out to the imaginary listener. She actually metaphorically offers the concept to her audience. So this is a clear case of viewpoint blending. And the gesture has two functions, representational and pragmatic. Okay, now let me show this to you.
And this...
Okay.
And this concept of biodiversity going down is not very true.
And another example is actually we have restarts as disfluency moments followed by resolution. And again, the gesture is a mixture of representation, molding, and pragmatic function, which is beat.
With the ideas behind it.
Should I show it again?
With the ideas behind it.
So what she does, she actually molds these ideas with the ideas behind it.
With the idea.
So now let's have a look at questions 2 and 3. Are there significant differences in gestures used with disfluencies depending on the expertise of an interpreter and on the direction of interpreting? So the Kruskal-Wallis test, accompanied by witness tests for specific sample pairs, hasn't shown significant differences as to the amount of disfluencies in general and gestures with representational, pragmatic, and deictic functions that co-occurred with the disfluencies. And actually, which was a disappointment. But we had 2 exceptions. So the first one is that self-adapters are used or were used significantly more often with the less experienced simultaneous interpreters, which was quite in line with our hypothesis. And the second exception was that those interpreting from L2 to L1 first and from L1 to L2 second used significantly more representational and deictic gestures with disfluencies than those who had the opposite order of tasks. But if you ask me, I don't know how to explain this. Probably Alan will say something on that, but I'm not sure. So this was just a very short finding of it. We still don't know what to do with this, and probably we'll have to double check it as well. Right, so what are the implications of those somewhat negative results? Should we take other factors into consideration? Are more fine-grained analysis needed here? Let's have a closer look at that. I wonder how many minutes do I have left, Anna? Could you say this?
Yes, you have approximately 15 minutes left.
15 minutes, okay. Then probably I'll have some more time to go deeper into that. All right, so the first implication is actually memory. So the idea is that probably memory should be taken into consideration here because of the multitasking and because of those things that I described just a few minutes ago. And so there were psychological tests on verbal and spatial working memory provided to investigate if the differences in disfluencies, representational and pragmatic gesture uses can be attributed to working memory. And actually, some correlation tests have shown that for the less experienced interpreters, there is significant direct correlation between verbal memory and the amount of gestures used in the representational function and the pragmatic function. So probably there could be something in that, and probably we should go deeper into that. Implication number 2 is that we should use more fine-grained analysis. And if you allow me, I'd like to step back a bit and probably talk theory. So the question is, that is usually connected with this implication 2, whether gestures are signs or not signs. And if they are, what kind of signs are they? And what kind of implications does it have for our or any kind of gesture study? Generally, researchers agree on the semiotic nature of gestures. However, lots of questions remain. Are gestures discrete, compositional, or linear? Or are they global or synthetic? Are they mostly symbolic, or are there only emblems that are truly symbolic? Do they have their own semiotic features, or are they determined by the linguistic units they co-occur with? An elegant way of dealing with this question was offered by Camden and McNeill, who showed that gestures form a continuum in terms of communicative conventionality. Emblems that are the most symbolic or sign-like due to the stability of the form-meaning relations and dependence from context are placed at one end of this continuum, while idiosyncratic or non-conventionalized gestures are at the other end of this continuum. The advantage of Camden's continuum is that it shows that the semiotic status of gestures is a matter of degree. However, it places conventionality and arbitrariness at the center. So it sets gestures against a linguistic sign that is achieved as a model of a sign. So what we see here is this kind of language-centric or linguocentric approach. However, nowadays, signs and semiosis receive a much broader understanding under the influence of new branches of semiotics. And as some researchers believe, and Barbieri, for example, is among them, there are different types of semiosis. For example, there is interpreting semiosis based on communicative conventions like signs and language. And there is also signaling semiosis that organizes objects into working or functioning systems. The second model can be partially referred to gestures, since gestures are, as we know, spontaneous bodily actions, which means that they are basically natural signs like symptoms and signals. They are grounded in physiology neurology, psychology, along with social conventions and contextual constraints. Most of them are based on mimetic schemas, according to Zlatev. And unlike words, they primarily establish short-term physiological, rather than long-term mental associations with the signified, with the exception of emblems, of course. That is why producing co-speech gestures can be characterized both as interpreting and signaling types of semiosis. So gestures are signs in a variety of ways, and they're characterized by a highly variable set of parameters. To illustrate this point, let me show you two radar charts that show the difference in semiotic profiles of three types of gestures: emblems, representational, and discourse structuring, or the way we call it, pragmatic gestures. I hope that you see the parameters. Probably, if you have some questions, then I will explain it later. Importantly, the set of the semiotic parameters is variable both on the generic and the individual levels of gesture use. So if we look at gestures as a semiotic system, it is resistant to form meaning entrenchment, even in multiple instances of usage events. It is organized following the family resemblance principle, and gestures taken together as a system are partially dependent on speech. These semiotic qualities of gestures have methodological implications for our project, because it means that the boundaries between any types of gestures would be fuzzy, and individuals, as we all know, would differ in how much they gesture and what kind of hand movements they prefer. And here, I actually remembered about Goldberg's quote, and she writes that companion qualitative analyses are thus needed to examine how individual, social, and contextual factors interact with the phenomenon under study. One of the ways is to build gestural profiles for groups and individuals of simultaneous interpreters that show both diversities and some kind of similarities between smaller groups within our participants. Probably we may call them ideolects, or as some people call it, Gestulax. And here, just as a kind of experiment, you see actually gestural profiles of three individual interpreters. They are less experienced, and we see that what we have here is this kind of vertical axis with protruding angle towards self-adapters, and also with, in some cases, towards pragmatic gestures as well. So if we go further with that, we actually can see that we could find some kind of subtle differences and similarities, paying more attention to individual approaches or individual styles of using gestures. And we actually noticed that with Alan and the rest of the group, and that sometimes you have a person who actually likes, when doing simultaneous interpretation, there were people who actually like using pragmatic gestures, or for example, they use more self-adapting gestures. And this is really interesting that you could even give them some kind of nicknames, but we didn't do that. All right, so concluding remarks for this talk are the following. Gestures are used extensively in simultaneous interpretation. Self-adapters and pragmatic gestures prevail. The dominance of pragmatic gestures used in simultaneous interpretation suggests that when we construe information within and across languages, we cognitively simulate not only objects that we refer to, but other people's intentions and their bodily acts or embodiment. This process can be referred to as viewpoint blending. Neither hypothesis, the amount of difficulties and the functional characteristics of gestures, relates to the expertise of the interpreter and to the direction of interpreting is confirmed at this stage of the research. So other factors should be taken into consideration, for example, the factor of verbal memory. And finally, a more nuanced qualitative analysis should follow. These analyses could rely on gestural profiles for individual speakers, grouped according to their prevailing gestural axes. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you very much.